Thank you so much also for that you're all coming this morning or early afternoon after the party last night. I hope you had all a great night, and I'm very happy to share a bit like my research with you, because many of these stories and many of the people portrayed in the quilts are not so well known in the also in Germany, but also outside of Germany, of course. So I really want to share a bit like this research with you as well, and how I started the quilt series actually, and what it means to me, because like it's many times also very personal research, but then it's also really like for me like really to find like a new way to portray them. So not only necessarily like in a classical portrait painting, like an iconic image of the person portrayed, but really like find actually an own materiality for each of the persons and places and magazines. There are also a couple of quilts about magazines. And specifically I want to talk about like this 4 quilts here on display to share like this research with you. If there are any questions, please feel free to interrupt me at any moment, and content-wise, but also like if something wasn't clear or I mispronounced something, please feel free to ask questions at the end. At the end of the film, of the presentation, I will show my short film about Lana Kaiser. The quilt about Lana Kaiser is here, the orange one, with the 2 layers of silkscreen prints on PVC print or foil. And yeah, but I will start a bit shortly in the beginning to give an overview how it started for me. As you said already, like I became a member of the Forum Queeres Archiv München, a small self-organized archive in 2013, so exactly 10 years ago now, and this has influenced my practice ever since a lot. I was researching a lot about or reading many books by Hubert Fichte, for example, or books by Magnus Hirschfeld, for example, as well. And this was, this started already before, so to say, but like to become like an active member of a self-organized archive, where like everyone who's doing this voluntary work is really doing it out of an own dedication as well. Like it's not like a state-run archive where it's only like a procedure and a protocol to follow, but like really like a place, to tell like from a personal perspective also more these stories, where like it's very much more about like why do these materials and these histories still do matter to us. And I think this became so fascinating for me. So it's one part of the archive is of course like the queer content of the archive, but I think like over the last 10 years, the structure of the archive and how histories and knowledge being preserved or something there, and really making like kind of like counter narratives to tell like history not only from the perspective of the powerful people, but also like from people who perhaps like suffered from homophobic or queerphobic politics in our past. And these queer organizations and archives were of course found in times, most of the time, where really like state and city archives really failed to preserve like these queer histories. And so when we look on queer histories like from the 19th century, most of the time, the only materials we do have now is only like the materials of the police criminalizing and the medicine medicalizing queer people, but we never have like proud emancipatory perspectives where someone is describing themselves. And I think this shift of like, for example, like oral history is a very important part of our practice there in the archive to really, capture these more intimate encounters into history and how you became like a witness yourself or something. This process of becoming a witness yourself became very important to me. And the beginning of the first work, you can see a still here and here also like a still of the film set, was a video installation together with this artist book. The artist book is also in German and in English. If you like, we can also just give it around, was retelling the beginning of the AIDS crisis in Germany. I was adapting to an installation by Group Material, an artistic activism group from the 80s and 90s in the United States, but kept the structures, but filled like the materials from our archive in Munich. And then in the film you see like one slow camera movement along the timeline, focusing on some parts. There are also like oral history interviews I made for the video installation, which became part of it with the founder of the Munich AIDS support. And Munich was quite, like with Fassbinder, you perhaps also know, was quite more like the center of queer life in the 1980s, but like the political and social repressions in the 80s then during the AIDS crisis really made a lot of queer people leave the city actually. And I found it so interesting that me, like born in Germany, I knew much more about the political and social repressions in the UK, in the United States during the AIDS crisis, and didn't know anything at all about the situation in Germany actually. And this made me really like, this was the starting point actually, first of all, out of an own interest or something, to go to this archive and collect these stories and questioning the same time why these stories became not part of like an historic canon or something, but like also perhaps like questioning the process of like this canon way of describing histories. And for the film actually, or the video installation, I made actually the first quilt, which you can see here and lying on the floor. So the first one was not hanging yet from the ceiling, because there was also not like, quilting was really like during the AIDS crisis with the AIDS memorial quilts, a very common technique to remember the people we lost due to the complications of AIDS. And this technique just didn't exist so much in Germany. And it was for me like a very intimate way to remember these people we lost as well. And really finding like through their textiles, like clothes, really like a really different way to portray them. So I adapted the system, and so the first quilts actually, the first 6 I think, were then really remembering people who died under complications of AIDS. But in this point, like the archive was also like very much not well organized yet. We did a lot of work the past 10 years in that, and we gained also a lot of young members actually. I was the first artist to become a member in this archive as well. This was also kind of like a really different perspective for them as well I had on the materials. But before there was mainly like texts describing like the past, but like really like discussing also like the aesthetics around it, also like formal decisions of self-organized posters and stuff like that was really inspiring for me as an artist as well, and see like the aesthetics not separated from the political issues and see them compiled. And then sometimes it was the case that, for example, like you opened a box and it was saying AIDS outside the box, but then inside the box was suddenly like a queer magazine from the 1920s. So like I started to research more like also like the past, but with some quilts, for example, like the Lana Kaiser quilt, I also got more into my own present and people I met, for example, as well, like Lana. So so ever since, this is an installation I think 2 or 3 years ago at the Württembergischer Kunstverein in Stuttgart, where I presented I think like 19 quilts. It was the biggest amount I ever shown so far. So yeah, as I said already, there are 52 right now, and the whole series became almost like an index for me, like continuing this research now, supporting like with my abilities as an artist, like doing graphic design for them, doing the social media as well, like using like these tools I got a bit learned at the Art Academy, more or less, and share them with them, but then really like transferring like through these quilts also the research then again in like aesthetic decisions again, and like in my own like language as well, which is of course like from the first quilts to the most last ones also like developing of course over time. And then every time or I show them together with the curator, like here now, it's really then about like finding new narrations to tell these stories and finding solidarities between them. For me, like they're hanging not only next to each other, it's also like each time like a new focus, a new part of their histories, I can tell. But they are not only about representation. Like I do say the names, and many times it's also written like their date of birth and their date of death. But like,
would it help if we go through actually the decisions we made around selecting them?
Yeah.
And their names.
Yeah.
So you can see here, this is Charlotte Woolf, right here, Lana Kaiser, Lorenza Böttner, and then you have Daniel
Paul Schreber.
But we were having quite in-depth conversations about the conversations they would have with each other.
Yeah.
And have these been presented before together, these selection?
I think like the Charlotte Woolf quilt was actually, it's only the second time it was shown. It was last year in a show in Munich about queer life from the beginning of 20th century in a museum remembering like the Holocaust. So this is also like a very, like it's quite a jump like from early 20th century to the 1980s here, also early 20th century, or even like late 19th century, and then Lana Kaiser, who died in 2018. So yeah, no, it's the first time definitely to have, and it's quite a wide range between them of 100 years actually, yeah.
Yeah, because I visited you in Amsterdam last year for a studio visit, and there was conversations. Originally, Magnus Hirschfeld was going to be here in the room too, and obviously his history as a sexologist in Germany and one of the first people to kind of perform gender-affirming care surgeries. But Charlotte was, if I'm correct, one of the only women and Jewish people working as a sexologist in Germany at the time. So you have a connection between, obviously, the science of queerness, or how queerness is pathologized.
Yeah.
And then you have someone like Lorenza Böttner, who was a disabled trans woman artist, really, I mean, an icon of mine. And thinking about how her life was pathologized almost 100 years later.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So actually there's quite a lineage from like the work about the AIDS crisis to Lorenza as well, because like then I got a lot of like newspaper articles or history interviews found in the archive, but I didn't find so much artistic production from Germany during the AIDS crisis in the 1980s and peak of the AIDS crisis in the 1980s and 1990s. And then someone told me about like Rabe Perplexum, who was a friend of Lorenza Böttner as well. And through Lorenza Böttner, through Rabe Perplexum, I came then also across the first time to Lorenza's work, actually through this exhibition or performance series which happened in 1988 in Munich. And I got like, there was a small catalog made together with the performance series afterwards. And there I read for the first time the name Lorenza, but it was only, I saw the photos of the performance and was completely captured by them and fascinated by them immediately. But like, I Googled Lorenza artist, Munich, 1980s or something, nothing appeared. So this is of course like also like, Lorenza and Rabe, they were both really important for the performance queer art scene of the 80s, but this is of course the time also before the internet, and then both of them died in the 90s, so they were not able to maintain their own legacy, so to say, almost. And with Rabe Perplexum, it was even the case, they died in 1996, so 2 years after Lorenza. Their estate was then shown in one time in a posthum retrospective by Cosi Piero, about whom I also worked a lot. So it's really like this friendships, very often doing one research, I come to the next ones. And then their estate went to a city archive, which was actually more focusing on literature. And they were completely overwhelmed about like this, like Rabe was such an intense performance artist as well, doing like really punk kind of performances, that they didn't categorize it, and then by law they were not allowed to have any visitors in their archive out of data protection rights if someone else private data is shared in the archival materials. So no one was allowed to visit the state archive, the archive owned by the city archive. The estate owned by the city archive for 25 years then after the death, and I had to fight actually for 4 years to be able to get access to that. And I think like, yeah, this tells already like how, even it's not so long time ago, and we did a couple of exhibitions now around Rabe Perplexum, but also Lorenza Böttner are organized like with a mother who's still living in Munich, or history talks with her. And every time there came a lot of people who knew Lorenza back then. Lorenza was performing a lot on the streets, making like paintings with her feet on the street as kind of like something between a dance and painting. The smaller works are made with a mouth. When she was 8 years old, she lost her 2 arms at an accident and moved then with her mother from Chile to Germany because the medical situation was much better there. And then Lorenza managed to study actually in the art academy in Kassel. That's why Lorenza's work was then also shown 7 years ago at Documenta. And it was then quite fascinating. A friend of mine worked for Documenta, and he was telling me, knowing that I was researching a lot about the AIDS crisis in Munich, if I came across ever an artist called Lorenza Böttner. And first I said no. But then it took me a while till I recognized I do actually know the work through Rabe's work as well. And then when I met the mother for the first time, she also told me, I was asking like with which artist was Lorenza hanging out in Munich actually, and she was like, yeah, Munich was very, excluding her from the classical art system. She was more performing really on the streets, having not access to the classical art institutions. But there was actually one performance artist who was, they were neither male nor female. They were kind of really dark, always with very dark makeup, and they were called something like a bird or something. It was like, oh my God, this must be Rabe Perplexum. Rabe is like the German word for raven. So Rabe decided to be neither male nor female, but really we want to become an animal from 83 onwards. So yeah, these connections were really fascinating for me. And here you can see Lorenza in front of one of her self-portraits. In many of the works, she was actually dealing like with her own body as well, but like there are many works as well which has something very poetic. So you can see, of course, like here already like the painting, which was then the reference for the print or some of the prints on the fabric. And yeah, it was very funny. The mother is now 84, and she actually kept the estate of Lorenza. Even no one was interested till Documenta for more than 20 years in her own apartment. She had like 2.5 rooms, and one room was completely inaccessible because it was completely full. Even Lorenza even didn't get 40 years old, dying then also on the complications of AIDS. She left a huge oeuvre actually behind, and many of them were actually a lot about shoes or something. And it was quite amazing at like this 84 or 83-year-old woman having like sharing with the whole audience at the oral history talk we organized that, yeah, the shoes, actually, Lorenza had this from me. I had also very much a shoe fetish. I laughed when when people really liked my high heels. When I was young, I loved wearing high heels. And this was actually like, yeah, a very beautiful moment of showing myself as actually how much the mother of Lorenza, Irene Böttner, who became over the last years a very close friend of mine. She donated 2 of the works from Lorenza also to our archive. We're the only institution in the world who's owning works of Lorenza, which is quite amazing, like our small archive. But yeah, I'm really getting also like not seeing like the artist as like singular entities or something, seeing like their social exchanges as well, and how you can really see how Lorenza and Rabe influenced each other, and like this play of genders in times where there was no wording yet existing, like gender non-binary or transhuman or something, was really like, it was not like an academic discourse first, as it's often wrongly, I think, described now. It was actually like a lived practice, actually. And I think this is what is so important then to me, and why these works, I think, matter so much in these days where from a right-wing side, it's so often told like, oh, this issues around trans are like a hype or something. But like looking back at Charlotte Woolf or Lorenza, it gives us proof really that people playing with their gender, finding new words to describe their sexuality and gender, feeling limited by the existing language we have still in use actually, and reflecting this language as well. Like Lorenza was actually writing her degree work about, in the Fine Art Academy in Kassel, was about the freak and how like people with disabilities were really like in the freak shows in till the 19th century being really like displayed, and really reflecting this in own works as well. And yeah.
But I mean, that's why I thought it was so important that you showed this work and that was featured here, because it's not directly disabled history. But the thing that became so frustrating, and that you realize when you work with disabled artists, especially who are no longer around, is that their archives don't exist, and their archives and their work is presented through a medical lens. So you might, I mean, let's say for example, J.J. Began, who the festival is dedicated after, and you can see his drawings everywhere. His archive is owned by the Wellcome Collection, which is a collection of medical history in London, and that's not his own words. That's not he's no control. And by presenting artists here who would have been pathologized in their own time, and certainly when we think about gender and sexuality today, it's becoming repathologized. That the way that particularly trans and gender non-conforming people are seen as just solely medical. It's really important to have evidence of artists who were queer and disabled working outside of those to their own words. Yeah.
And really like questioning these words as well, and like sharing them in a really visual way. I think like this is also like one of my favorite paintings by Lorenza, and I wanted to share this specifically because like the reference from this work to the quilt is also quite directly. You can see her like in a gray, black, very elegant dress on the left side, which is then referring to the fabric on the left side of the quilt, and then like a very sporty kind of dress in the middle as well, reflecting on the selection of the fabric, the orange fabric in the middle, and then like a suit referring like to the cashmere kind of like suit clothes on the right side. So like sometimes it is more literal or really referring like to the way they were dressing themselves, but like sometimes it's also like other references. I'm selecting the fabric, but like this really like about like, yeah, finding this text, yeah, the materiality to describe, yeah, these discussions, and yeah.
I love this work.
So here you can see the quilt, and then here on our back is the quilt about Charlotte Woolf. I think like it's also quite interesting. I didn't know that about the Wellcome collection, because the estate of Charlotte Woolf is also in the Wellcome collection actually. And when we met actually back then in London, I was doing a residency at Delphina Foundation in London, and during the residency I visited, I really wanted to see the estate about Charlotte Woolf, and was in the Wellcome collection, who has of course an own legacy as well of medicalization and criminalization, which the collection is really problematizing themselves as well. But of course, like there's still so many blind spots in these archives. I think also in our archive, by the way. Like I think like these works of inclusion will never be fulfilled. There will never be a point where like, now it's done and we did it or something. I think it's an ongoing process, but I think like to problematize own collections, I think that's really like the biggest part of me. And Charlotte Woolf is so interesting for me because she's really connecting like a first queer movement from the 1920s to a second one from the 1960s onwards. Charlotte Woolf was born in the beginning of 20th century and was, as you said already, one of the few female sexologists in the Weimar Republic time in Berlin. And then when the Nazis came into power, she was actually targeted out of 3 reasons. One was her Jewish family history. The second one, she was what we would perhaps call like gender non-binary as well, like wearing always suits and then dressing in a very masculine way, and being stopped by the Gestapo in Berlin then and being fined for wearing male's clothes. So this is one of the text layers around the circle on the passport photo. So this is the passport photo when she escaped first to France and then to Paris and then to London and lived the rest of her life in London. And then the third part was she was researching about Verhütung, birth control, which was then also, of course, like by the fascist ideology, then also being forbidden then as well. So she had to leave very early, immediately after the NSDAP came into power. She was not able to work anymore and then moved first to Paris. And then in Paris, she was unfortunately not being able to work as a doctor. It was difficult, as it's unfortunately with refugees still today, often to get like your profession being recognized by the place you moved to. So she had to find another way to finance herself. So she was starting to read hands of a lot of people. She became very much friends to a lot of surrealists like Pietro and Salvatore Dali, and was starting then to read hands. She was actually very critical about it and was making jokes at the end of the life. There were beautiful footages of her in the 30s reading hands. And in the estate actually of the Welcome collection is also like, for example, like the handprints of Salvatore Dali, or also like Virginia Woolf, which was this really amazing moment, like quite an intimate moment almost, like to have like this handprint, something like so direct. And you were even allowed to touch them without gloves or something. So it was quite an amazing moment. And so you can see a photo of her mirrored on the front side of the quilt, which is made by Man Ray, the photographer, in 1935, in the middle layer. And then from the other side of the back side, it's one of she published 2 biographies then actually in the 1970s and describing her own bisexuality, actually very open there. And it's the first love story in Danzig, which was a bit outside of Berlin, which is now Poland. One of her first loves, so there's quite on the back side. So sometimes it's also playing with the front and the back side, this more intimate love story of hers, one of her first ones. And the one line is also saying like, the coincidences made me to a sexual scientist. So it took like till the end 40s, beginning 50s, that she got the license back to work as a doctor again. And she published then the first works about Magnus Hirschfeld in the 1970s, because like the gap, of course, of fascism and the Second World War was so big that it took really like over 20, 30 years that these researchers and impacts became really awakened again. And I think this is, for me, really interesting of her. In the end of her life, in the 70s and 80s, she actually moved a lot back to Germany and visited a lot of like feminist groups there in Berlin, and was, for example, like really advocating like the inclusion of trans women in the feminist movement, and described this quite surprisingly that it will become a really big problem if these feminist groups will not be more trans inclusive. She actually she used like still the word transvestite and not transgender, but I think we can forgive her about that. And it was also like the lack of vocabulary still back then. But yeah, it was quite an amazing moment to see, yeah, someone from this background experiencing the Weimar Republic, and then bringing like, it was so much more trans-inclusive actually, the Weimar Republic, than the 70s and 80s actually.
I mean, this is really interesting that what the history that this exposes, because obviously Hirschfeld, for those unfamiliar, was a sexologist working as a contemporary of Charlotte, and he had one of the first centres that treated queer people, specifically trans and gender non-conforming people. He was one of the first people to perform gender-confirming surgery on trans women, but he is kind of credited as the father of kind of sexology, or but the early gay rights movement in Ireland, there was a centre in Dublin called the Hirschfeld Centre. So Hirschfeld was credited as kind of like, he was even there at the beginning of the queer rights movement in Ireland, yet there's figures like Charlotte who may have been more contemporary and open-minded and trans-inclusive than Hirschfeld may have been, because he definitely had his faults.
Definitely, we do have to accept this. I think like in the beginning of the series of quilts, the people were also like, oh, so these are your heroes or something. And I found many parts, with some more, some less, very important for me. But like, it's also like, I think I do understand that in the 70s and 80s, where really like a new queer movement was only slowly possible again, it was really a focus on the more emancipatory stories. But I think now we really can allow this complexities of their histories as well, and also, look at like the more conflicts in their biographies as well. And yeah, there is a big part which was also like then really like a time of like the whole sexuality in the 20s and 30s had also very, in race theory, like very problematic parts as well, ordering the people, like Hirschfeld had like this idea of like sexuelle Zwischenstufen, to think not about gender in a binary, but like really seeing it more like a spectrum, which is really productive. But then the way he ordered it became, of course, super medicalized and really, displaying like queer people as well in a very violent manner as well. So I think like, we have to allow these complexities, I think,
Is it true that Charlotte was claimed that everyone was bisexual? Was that her?
Yeah. I think like also like in the outside of the hand there in the first print, it's also a very interesting quote, because there she's saying like, the deeper I went into the research about Hirschfeld, the more I realized how incorrect the labels are we still using. So I found this also like, this was at the last biography of her, at the end of the biography, this was almost like a credo after, like she published then in the 50s and 60s and 70s, like books about lesbian love and bisexuality actually. And this was her conclusion actually as well, which I found kind of also very productive,
Bisexuality is very productive, yeah.
So these are like, on the left here you can see like one of her poems as well. She was also writing poems and novels, one from the early 1924, the left one is, and then a lesbian magazine from the 1980s on the right side. I hope it's 80s, 87, where you can see here Charlotte on the right talking to a younger generation of feminist lesbian movement, and having her on the headline was also like, to have these two times here next to each other was, I think, and here like some of her books, like the Psychology about Lesbian Love on the left side, and the book about bisexuality. And it was many people who had to escape then during the Nazi time. It took a long time for them to return to Germany, or for some it was really like painful. They lost also their language, so to say. Like she's also describing this, speaking French a little bit, but not English actually so well before moving to London. It was actually took a long time to write in English then as well. So really like refusing to have the German language, but then being able to go back in the 70s, I think was also great courage of her. And yeah, this is the back, like the more private, intimate love story of hers. And then like there's the last quilt here on our back about Daniel Paul Schreber. Or did you want to add something to Charlotte?
No,
okay. Daniel Paul Schreber was a lawyer based in Dresden, and he was running for the Reichstag in the I did write it down in 1884. And his father was a reform pedagogue, like reformist pedagogy, which was very violent in many times as well. Like he experimented with his own children, tools to not being able to touch themselves, for example, to forbid them their own, bodies or something almost, really limiting their own bodies. And then after not succeeding running for office, brought him in a deep mental crisis, and he was then for the first time in a mental hospital, which of course like was experimenting then a lot with electroshock therapy was experimented on him. And then, but he was coming from an actually like very educated background. So like then in the beginning of 19th century, shortly before he died, he was able to publish his own history of how he was treated in a medical hospital, and but also in a very beautiful way describing also like his visions, and I think like this is, I wanted to share actually here the text which is written on the quilts, which was really important for me to include his own words. So this is a book I made about like the first 30 quilts actually. And if you like, you can also perhaps give it around. And I wanted to share like really, because then Freud wrote this very misogyn and very transphobic, homophobic text about him, never meeting Daniel Paul Schreber. It's called the Schreber Cases. So this is the text, the novel, or not the novel, the report about his own medicalization, which is like the first, it's perceived as the first, like from their own perspective, written report. And then there, I didn't want to include the cover of the text by Freud, which was then a very kind of like narration, like he had such a powerful, beautiful father, and he failed to be as masculine as his father, so he became ill, is becoming woman, so he had visions of becoming woman and having like God energy coming from his anus. So the description of Freud is really, really problematic, and then was, for example, criticized as well, like by Deleuze and Guattari in the Anti-Oedipus text, which you might know. And so I came through Anti-Oedipus to the Freud text, and then I really wanted to read like his own words and find them actually still quite empowering. So I wanted to share them with you. So the text, the translation. So in the quilt book, all the German text, or also sometimes Greek or Dutch text, are translated into English. In an unorthodox manner, Schreber describes the path that his rays of light from the faraway worlds takes in his body. They do not run in parallel lines, but in a kind of figure eight of parable. And of course spoken, of course, or why don't you spoken, why don't you consumes about 30 to 60 seconds every time until it's fully pronounced. Bad news arrived from all sides. Now also this or that star, this or that constellation would have to be abandoned. Soon they said of Venus was flooded. Soon now the whole solar system would have been decoupled. Soon Xaxopia, the entire constellation, had to be collected around one single sun. Soon only their plates had some hope for survival. We are all perverts. We are all libido that is too sticky and too easily movable, and not according to one's own moods and desires. Schreber goes through stages of circle and switches from one circle to another. He's not at the center, not consumed by the machine, without a fixed identity, always decentered, and becomes accessible by passing through these different stages. He, who had let himself be fucked, claims to have been presiding over a senate? And be without fear, it works. President Schreber feels something, produces something, and furthermore succeeds in theorizing it. So, yeah. And yeah, so for me, like this quilt was then really like a critique on psychotherapy, like in the early stage, having this, like, yeah, having a desire like, oh, I want to become woman, ending like, of course, like through electroshock therapy. And I think this is this is so interesting for me, because very often actually like the only way queer life is documented is then through police documents actually, or medical reports, making like these tests on them. And this is really like from the beginning of 20th century, one of the few examples actually we have where it's not someone from the outside describing themselves, but like someone, yeah, describing, having their own voice and having access to publish this voice. Should I?
Do we have time? Yeah, we'll quickly go through Lana, yeah.
So, and then one, I want to end like with Lana, of course, and perhaps not so much end here. So you can see the quilt over there, and all the photographs on the quilt are actually made by me, or photos of me and Lana in my teenage years. So Lana was in the first season of American Idol, the German version of it, and soon became more known than Angela Merkel back then, who just became chancellor. So 95% of Germany knew her, and unfortunately, like, she was really used by the reality TV format to kind of portray her as a freak. And Lana, it's only 20 years ago, but so it was 2002, 2003, she was in this casting show. She refused then, like, I'm not male, I'm not female, I'm just Daniel. And only the last half year of her life, she was identifying as a trans woman before disappearing on a cruise ship to the Way of America. And she was really, like, for me, actually, the way into the art world. She made a film with Uli Lommel, an actor and director who worked a lot with Andy Warhol and Fassbinder, and I was invited to Uli Lommel's collaboration with Lana, which was a film called Dani der Zauberer. Some quotes are in the video as well. And then I was interviewing for the school newspaper, actually. Here you can see me with Lana. I think I must have been like, this must be 2004, so baby Philipp.
She's great.
Interviewing then Uli Lommel for the school newspaper about Warhol and Fassbinder was quite, yeah, I was only 14 and coming not from a family who was at all connected to the art world at all. So this, like, Lana was always portrayed as this very trash TV kind of character, but like I didn't know her well, but like she was actually like a very tender soul and really like encouraging me in a time where queer culture or gay and lesbian culture in the public media was always either as freak or in a very normalized kind of like normalized, kind of like early 2000s, like not portraying yourself as female, as someone assigned male at birth, just having really these taboos early, very present, not only in the countryside where I grew up, but also in the TV actually. She was like the only one I could really identify, and in her disappearance and most likely death, then in 2018 made me do first this quilt, revisiting all the photos I made of her and photos of us, the two of us made together. This was a way I showed the work as well. But then also working on a scene about her together with a video installation, which is 30 minutes long. And yeah, if the magazine has like a text by me about Lana, and even like after her death, even she had like a public coming out on Instagram as a trans woman. The media was still in 2018, even the BBC in the UK was refusing to call her by a self-chosen female name and still called her by a male name, Daniel Kübelberg. And so this, like the title is, of course, quite a choice, so to say, which is for me, of course, like natural to call her. And in the end, there's actually like by another great Irish artist, Jack Hogan and Eli Hill, two interviews about and a conversation we have. Eli coming from the US, Jack coming from Ireland, but like how they didn't know Lana before, but how queer people were also in Ireland and the US, of course, in the early times of reality TV, always portrayed as the freak and kind of like a way to make the people to watch and really like problematizing them till it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. Like it was continued for every motto show, like every episode of like this casting show, it was like she's dividing Germany, till she was dividing Germany and couldn't go on the streets almost till the end of her life without support by the police, having death threats. And yeah, so really thinking through figures like, or histories like Lana's, really like about visibility as well in a different way, not seeing it as only something positive, but also like I think Lana's history is really telling us so much about like how painful this visibility can be. So yeah, if you want to know a bit more about Lana, feel free to get to one of the scenes afterwards, and perhaps we should go straight into the film.
Let's do the film. It's beautiful.